Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Korver. Today we are joined by Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky has been called the father of modern linguistics and is one of the most cited scholars in modern history. He has been a professor at MIT since 1955, now Emeritus, and continues to teach at the University of Arizona at the age of 91. He has written over 100 books covering topics including linguistics, politics, and philosophy. Today, I will discuss with him issues ranging from science, the history of science, philosophy of mind, to moral political philosophy, and also law. This episode is also part of a larger series called Understanding Noam Chomsky on this channel. If you're interested, you can check out those episodes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode. The Dare to Know podcast is now also available on iTunes and Spotify. Please check out the links in the description below. Professor Chomsky, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
Glad to be with you.
Great, thank you so much. So to start off, I would like to start off with some questions related to the philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, cognitive science more broadly, and then I would like to end some questions related to moral philosophy and political philosophy.
Okay.
But to start off, in epistemology, philosophers also often talk about the knowing how, knowing that dichotomy, and you convincingly argue that we can't capture certain bodies of knowledge using this dichotomy. We ought to complement these types of knowledge by knowledge of, namely knowledge of rules and principles, such as in language and vision. Why have philosophers been so reluctant in accepting this type of knowledge? And how does adding this type of knowledge change the project of epistemology more broadly?
Well, first of all, philosophers, for the most part, have never heard of it. So that there's no question of accepting it. Philosophers don't read outside of strict philosophy regimen. Yeah, so most had never heard of it. But even ones who have, like my old friend Jerry Fodor, could never agree that knowledge of language, which was the crucial issue, was anything other than propositional attitudes. It can't possibly be true, but it's a kind of an established doctrine. It's either an ability knowing how to talk or knowing that so and so, although if you think about it, it can't be. A lot of this has to do with problems about the English word know. I mean, if philosophy was being done in some other language, a lot of these questions wouldn't arise. So in many languages, you don't say things like, he knows a language. You say, he has a language is in him, other or he speaks the language, some other locution is used. In English, it happens that the word know is used in a very broad sense, much beyond the other languages and beyond the technical usage that philosophers keep to, which has something to do with warranted true belief. Okay, that's a kind of a core starting point for epistemology, but that's not the way the concept of knowledge is used. I mean, if somebody knows American history, you mean he understands a lot of things. It's not just he can reel off a lot of facts. That's the way you may pass an exam, but that's not knowing American history. My old friend, the late Julius Moravchik, once suggested that we might do better by, instead of trying to talk to philosophers, instead of using the word know, use the word understand, which has a broader, doesn't lead you into these byways. But certainly knowing the language is not going to be based on justified true belief, no matter what bells and whistles you add to it. And it's not going to be based on a capacity to do things. You and I may have very different capacity to use English. Maybe you're a great poet, I'm not. So, but we still have the same language. And the same is true of other elements. So if you want a concept of epistemology that is based on what we acquire and use, the technical notion of the philosophical literature is not going to be sufficient. I mean, everyone who talks about these issues has read Wittgenstein. but they don't seem to have absorbed his message, which is don't get caught up in the technical notions of philosophy that may mislead you. Get out of the fly bottle. Look at the way the concepts are really used. And the way the concepts are really used, it's different. And we use know in a way which it does have many of the connotations of understanding. It's not the same concept. But, so it's as far as epistemology is concerned, it's a matter of, do we want to capture what human beings have plainly internalized when they can use and understand language, interpret visual space, and so on. If we want to encompass that, well, then knowing how and knowing that is not sufficient. If we don't want to encompass it, just keep to the technical terms.
That's very fascinating. Moving on a bit, one of the things that you often stress in your work is how Newton's discoveries destroyed the notion of body or the notion of the physical. It simply became unintelligible, you say. And you argue that after Newton, the goals of scientific inquiry were implicitly restricted, moving away from conceivability as a criterion for true understanding towards the aim of creating intelligible theories of the world. And you stress that this is a very important moment in the history of science. So could you maybe please explain the importance of understanding this restriction and what it did with science?
First, be clear about the facts, starting with Galileo and others at his time, but he was the most prominent. A concept developed of how to study the world. The scientists of the time were dissatisfied with the standard answers. There was, in neo-scholastic physics, there were proposed answers for just about everything. So, things attract and repel each other because of sympathies and antipathies. Bodies fall to the earth because that's their natural place. A heavy body, big ball of lead falls faster than a small ball of lead because it's heavier. Didn't have to be true, but that was the belief. And there were many. If you perceive something, say a triangle, I perceive your face. The face transfers itself through the air, the form of the face, it imprints itself on my brain. That's how I perceive it. Well, one of the great advances of the 17th century was to be puzzled about things that were taken for granted. And the puzzlement was to be resolved by what was called, at the time, the mechanical philosophy. Philosophy, of course, just meant science. So mechanical science. Mechanical science was, they didn't see it then. I think we can now interpret it as being pretty much our innate cognitive capacity to deal with and interpret the world around us. We just do it in an infant does it in certain natural ways, and shown by experiment decades ago that if a child is presented with, say, two sticks, not quite touching, and when this one moves, that one moves, they automatically assume that there's a physical connection between them. That's just the way we interpret the world. Can't interpret it any other way. And this was reinforced by the fact that at the time, artisans in Europe were constructing all kinds of amazing artifacts which appeared to duplicate what people were doing, digestion of a duck, clocks doing all kind of amazing things. It was all over Europe, and it was very exciting. And all the kinds of things an artisan could, in principle, build in his backyard. That's the mechanical philosophy. Things push and pull each other, levers, gears, and so on. And that was the concept of intelligibility. According to, as Galileo put it very clearly, others accepted that a theory is intelligible if it can be duplicated by a mechanical object. Otherwise, it's simply unintelligible. It's more old-fashioned occult ideas and neo-scholastic mysticism. So that was the great transition. And this was the foundation of early modern science. Great scientists like Boyle, Huygens, Leibniz, Newton all simply assumed this is obvious. If scientific theory doesn't fall within those bounds, it's unintelligible. We don't have it's not giving us an intelligible picture of the world. And that's what science is about. Well, Descartes thought he had proved it. One of the volumes of Newton's Principia essentially goes through arguing why Descartes' vortex theory doesn't work. And he concluded finally that we have a mathematical principle that accounts for motion, but we have no model of it, no mechanical model of it. He was harshly criticized by the great figures of his day, Leibniz, Huygens, others, for reinstituting occult ideas. And he didn't disagree. Newton agreed that it was, as he put it, an absurdity to assume that things could interact without contact. And in fact, he spent the rest of his life trying to find some hidden subtle ether, hidden mechanism that would account for what this. And he said he doesn't agree that these are occult ideas in the sense of the neo-scholastics, because he has a mathematical theory which predicts, and they didn't. So it's an absurdity, but not quite back to neo-scholastic philosophy. Well, that's where things stood with Newton. He, of course, never found the mechanism he was searching for. Leibniz didn't, nobody did. Over time, scientists just gave up the enterprise, not with any specific recognition, as far as I can tell. It just sort of faded. We don't care if things are conceivable. The great philosophers of the time recognized it right away. So Locke, right after the Principia appeared, said, the estimable Mr. Newton has shown us that, he put it in a theological framework, that God has endowed matter with properties that are inconceivable to us. Okay, that's the way it is. We'll then proceed the best we can. What's these days called finding the best theory. So we'll just do that. If it's unintelligible, if it's inconceivable, that's too bad. Locke went on to add something very important, which has only recently been rediscovered. He said, just as God has assigned to matter properties inconceivable to us, he might have superadded to matter principles of thought. So some organization of matter has the property of thought. It's inconceivable to us, but it could have happened. So we then have to study the nature of these properties of matter, organized matter, that constitute thought. This was carried out right through the 18th century. A lot of work on it. They peaked with Joseph Priestley, chemist, philosopher, at the end of the century, who did very interesting work. You find it in Darwin's early notebooks. He says, why should we be more amazed that bodies have gravity than that they have thought? It's just the same thing. Things inconceivable to us, but seems to be a fact, so let's study it. Then it was forgotten. It was rediscovered in just about 20, 30 years ago. And now you read the Churchlands, Francis Crick, others, it's the astonishing hypothesis, the radical new idea in philosophy, which changes everything. Organized matter has the properties of thought. In fact, if you look at what they write, it's called the thesis of the new biology. It was the great discovery of the decade of the mind, last decade of the 20th century. basically the same words as Joseph Priestley and Locke's point. Meanwhile, David Hume, a little bit late after Locke, in his History of England, has a whole chapter on Newton, who he describes the greatest figure in human history. And he says that, I wish I could quote his exact words, but something like Newton has lifted the veil from some of the mysteries of nature, but has left others which are permanent that we will never understand. He's referring to this. But science just went on a different course. In fact, I think it was maybe 50 years before Cambridge University would even teach Newton's theories. And then Tom Kuhn, in his work on Copernican revolution, argued that Newton probably didn't call his work philosophy of nature or something like that, which would have meant real science, but only mathematical considerations, because couldn't really reach the level of pure science. And when Newton makes his famous statement about, I don't make hypotheses, this is what he was referring to. He said, we don't know. I can only say this seems to be the property, but I can't turn it into science. I don't know how to do that. Science meant philosophy. And then the sciences themselves just dropped the quest. So nowadays, nobody cares if the world is intelligible. What you care is whether the theory is intelligible. Now, Newton's theories were intelligible. In fact, people debated them. Berkeley argued that the proofs didn't go through because of an ambiguity in the notion of zero, but people certainly understood the theories. That was never an issue. So I think that's a significant transition in the history of science, which should be attended to. We have different goals. Now, that relates to questions that are being related now. So when, say, Tom Nagel says, I can understand how molecules rolling over each other could give you a liquid, but I can't understand, it's inconceivable to me that a physical object made of meat could have awareness of qualia. Well, the answer is too bad. Most of what happens is inconceivable to us. So what we do is just try to find the best theory about it. Conceivability is not a criterion for science.
No, I think that's very fascinating and very important lessons in the history of science to remember indeed. Shifting a bit to the topic of innateness. So I was reading some of the secondary literature on Kant, and I've noticed a distinction that was made between content innateness and mechanism innateness. And in another article from Paul Petrosky in the Cambridge Chomsky Cambridge Companion of 2006, he has an article called Innate Ideas, and he describes in that article that you probably don't endorse innate ideas in the traditional sense of people like Descartes. Namely, some people might consider an idea always to be an idea of X, thereby it being intentional and possessing some content. My question is, do you think it is helpful to distinguish between content innateness and mechanism innateness? And as a follow-up question, do you endorse some form of content innateness, or would you characterize it differently?
Well, first of all, I think we should start with what Descartes meant by innate ideas.
Yeah.
It's not what Locke criticized, which is what most people read. It's he has a discussion with Regis, as a paper called something like Notes on a Comment by Regis or something like that, in which he explains that ideas are dispositional. Innateness is a dispositional notion. So it's like having a tendency to get an illness. It's innate to you, that you are susceptible to tuberculosis. That, not him, of course, but whatever disease he was thinking about. That's what an idea is. It's something that, under what we would now call, in modern terms, the triggering effect of experience, elicits a thought. Okay, so an innate idea is not something that every idiot has, and so on. Locke's critique was not relevant. It's the kind of thing which will emerge in your mind on the uh, appropriate, if it's triggered by appropriate experience.
Mm-hmm.
Furthermore, idea for Descartes, it didn't just mean concept. I mean, a proposition was an idea. It's a much broader notion. It's a theoretical notion of the theory of mind. I think if we reinterpret Descartes, I think without distorting his meaning, but in modern terminology, we would take his concept of idea to be a theoretical component of the operations of the mind, which can be triggered by experience, but isn't there unless it is. So for example, take just the ability to see. If we know from experimental evidence with other mammals that if, say, a kitten is deprived of pattern stimulation in the first couple of weeks of life, it'll never see. And even the physiology is understood. The visual cortex, striate cortex degenerates, and so on. But in general, innate properties, capacity to grow, undergo puberty, whatever it may be, has to be triggered almost always. It's not just there. Probably language is similar to that. I mean, it's common to talk about learning language. That's the locution you use. And if you look at the philosophical literature, you're trained in language, given hundreds of examples of a word, and you kind of get it. It doesn't work like that at all. It just seems to grow in the mind. Very much the capacity to see grows in the mind. And these, what are called the innate concepts concerning language, are just these internal tendencies. Now then the question comes about what you just asked about the content and mechanism innate. I think that kind of dissolves when you look at the question. They just have no way to distinguish them. I mean, if you take the simple, what we think of as the simplest case, is very difficult, in fact, just learning a word. So take the first case that's discussed in the history of philosophy, I guess, the Heraclitus son crossing the river twice. Why do we know that he didn't put it in epistemological terms? For him, it's metaphysical. But the same with Aristotle. How do we know what's a house and so on? So if we look at these words like river and house, how do we get to understand them? It's not somebody points to us to the river, because as Heraclitus says, it's a different thing tomorrow, but it's still the same river. Aristotle says could look exactly like a house and not be a house. Depends on what he called its form, what it's used for, the design, and so on, all things that are in the mind. So just the point is to acquire the simplest words, we're already imposing a rich structure of innate concepts, which are not just sitting there, they have to be triggered, just like the ability to see. Now, is that mechanisms or content? How can you decide? It's everything. They just applied that way. And further, very good psycholinguistic experiments by now have shown that children learn words with miraculous speed on one trial exposure often. Like at the peak periods of language learning, around 2 or 3 years old, the child is picking up a word almost every waking hour. And further, words don't repeat. The words that repeat are the and of and so on. But if you look at the now statistical analyses of the whole body of speech that a child has gotten at age 2 or 3, and most even bigrams barely repeat, 2 words in sequence. The kids are picking it up just almost out of nothing, but getting the full, rich meaning. And this is shared in different languages. I mean, different languages, it's been thought that, that the sound meaning relation can vary almost arbitrarily. Well, that overlooks the fact that what's a possible sound is highly constrained by innate structures, and what's a possible meaning is deeply enriched by innate structure. So yes, just the superficial question of how do you pronounce this, that you learn in almost no time, one trial. But the concepts themselves are deeply embedded. And the mechanism for attaining them is just whatever the trickery does.
I see.
And when you look at richer properties of language, like what we're using when we communicate now, which is far more than the meanings of words, you get pretty much the same story. More and more seems as if it's just deeply embedded in the structures of the mind, and these are the mental acts that are taking place constantly with incredible speed. I mean, if you introspect just and think about what we call inner speech, just think about any complex experience you have, and think of the number of thoughts that pass through your mind in a microsecond. You can reconstruct them later, but they're all going way too fast for anything that we can understand. Much too fast for neural nets, for example. That can't be the mechanism. They're just much too slow. So some kind of computing mechanism is going on well beyond the level of understanding, might be down to the cellular level even, where there's a lot of extreme richness of computational possibilities. These are all matters explored on the borders of neuroscience. But all this is happening. We can do what Newton did with gravity. We can write theories about it. Maybe it'll be intelligible someday. This gets to the questions of consciousness, which come up later. We may or may not have an intelligible theory of what worries Tom Nagel and others, but it basically doesn't matter. We can only get an explanatory theory about it.
That's very helpful. Moving on a bit, in one of my conversations with John Collins, we talked a bit about the fact that you often don't directly talk about the notion of normativity, or at least what I'm aware of, in both the theoretical and in the practical domain. And in the theoretical domain, I'm talking about normative considerations such as simplicity, unity, and beauty. And he mentioned that those sort of normative considerations might just be included in your notion of science more broadly, or more specifically in the science forming faculty, that those normative considerations are somehow.
I mean, this is kind of, it's understandable that John Collins wouldn't be familiar with it. It's pretty abstruse materials, which you probably never read, like my undergraduate thesis. But the core problem for me from the very beginning was simplicity. I was a student of Nelson Goodman's in the 40s and was very impressed with his work. We were reading the draft of Structure of Appearance, Fact-Fishing Forecast, the work on simplicity that he did in the 1940s, where he was basically pointing out, I think correctly, that search for theory and search for simplicity are the same thing. If it's not, he was interested particularly in simplicity of constructional systems. So if you read Structure of Appearance, it's a kind of a revision of Carnap's Logische Aufbau, but using qualia instead of physical objects as the basic elements. And he wanted to know what's the primitive, he was interested in the primitive basis. How simple is the primitive basis? Now that's what drove him to his nominalism. Can't use notions like set. So, but he was pointing out that we have explanation to the point, up to the point where we have simplicity. Now my undergraduate thesis, which appeared about 30 years later in a retrospective publication, which nobody's ever seen, was about this. It was about how to take a complex, morphological, mostly linguistic system, but concentrating mostly on the morphophonemics, which was very intricate. It was for Hebrew, which has an intricate and complex morphophonemics I knew pretty well, how to get the simplest account of it. and turned out the simplest account was in terms of ordered rules, generative rules, which had to have a recursive denumerability as their basic property, but it was a study of what I was trying to show, that you could get a maximal simplicity by a particular ordering of these complex rules. And that's been the guiding, and in fact, the first paper I ever wrote was on simplicity in the form of grammars. It was never published. Anybody didn't know it, but it's, and this has been the main theme of my own work ever since. Mm-hmm. It's all concerned with explanation, where explanation means simplicity and elegance. That's in fact what lies behind looking for the minimalist program. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's kind of not, it's not orated, but it's hidden in the background. And I think Goodman's point is basically correct. Simplicity and explanation reduced to the same question. Simplicity is not a simple notion. It's not just a matter of counting the number of symbols. Mm-hmm. It's much more complex than that. So no time to go into it here, but I discussed it. Mm-hmm. Kinds of notations that are available to us in writing a theory. So you can invent a notation in which the most complex thing in the world comes down to one symbol. Mm-hmm. Define that symbol as that complicated thing. Mm-hmm. And that won't work. This is, by these days, it's used in computer science to count the number of symbols in a program, to see if the program is actually explaining something. Mm-hmm. That's a first step, but it doesn't go anywhere near what you have to have. Mm-hmm. But these notions, I think, are central.
And just to clarify, one follow-up question on that is, are they kind of just mind-imposed kind of regulative ideas? Like if we talk, for example, about the notion of unity specifically, so moving away, you basically ascribe to a view that says, yeah, these are just mind-imposed. Maybe
that's a good way to look at it. That's basically regulative ideas. Mm-hmm. The concept of finding there's no law of nature that says you have to look for explanations. Most of science doesn't bother with it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you read articles in science or nature, most of them are technical articles about what this microbe does under these circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's very interesting. In your work, you also often cite or mention the British Neo-Platonists, that they have very important insights related to cognitive science that have often been forgotten. And you in particular mention often Cudworth and talk about cognoscitive powers. Could you maybe clarify that? Because I still feel like that I don't fully grasp what that exactly amounts to.
Well, when I started reading Cudworth, and these people are pretty hard to read. I don't know if you've tried, but it's work. But if you read it and there's a lot of sort of mystical type rhetoric and vocabulary around. But if you look at what they were getting to, I think it was very rich. In fact, much richer than Kant, which is why I've tended to quote it instead of Kant. In fact, Kant apparently was influenced by this, according to the scholarly literature. But Cudworth in particular develops a pretty rich theory of the nature of the modes of cognition. And the basic concept is what Kant later developed, that experience conforms to the modes of cognition. And these modes are very rich. So he talked about what amount to Gestalt properties. So you identify figures in terms of qualities like symmetry, simplicity, connectedness, all sorts of things. And he went into I discuss a lot of this in Cartesian linguistics, and Jim McGilvray has a very extensive essay on it, which is very enlightening. It's the introduction to the second edition of my book, Cartesian Linguistics, an online edition, which he edited and wrote this long introduction to, mostly about Cudworth. But he has it. If you kind of have to extricate it from the hundreds of pages of convoluted text, but I think it's there, and it's these are what he called the cognoscitive principles, the organizing principles of cognition, which are the kinds of things that we were just talking about in connection with words like river and house. He didn't mention those, but there are internal principles with just organized experience. And so what we call experience is what conforms to the modes of cognition that we have. And these are all obviously deeply innate properties. It's kind of interesting that Nelson Goodman, who in some sense pushed this idea to its limit with his notion of versions, star making and so on, was radically opposed to the concept of innate ideas. That was absolute heresy for him. I knew him pretty well. I never saw how he could reconcile these two positions, because it seems to me that even take, say, fact fiction and forecast. I was a student of his when this was being written. We talked about it, but it always seemed to me there was an irreconcilable problem. So if you look at his solution to the new riddle in terms of projection, projectability, it doesn't answer the question of why the pigeon, let's say, is projecting green and not projecting grue. We have no distinction. There's no distinction, as he points out. So how come it wasn't projecting grue all the time? So that's the one that's entrenched. The only way out of this is to assume that green is innate. And in fact, it's interesting that Quine, who was working closely with Goodman in the 40s and 50s, sort of went part of the way in that direction. He was radically Skinnerian at the time. But if you look at word and object, he does assume that there's an innate quality space. Well, the quality space is answering the problems of projection. That's the same time as Goodman was writing fact fiction forecast. I don't know if they ever talked about it. He was forced to innate ideas in the Cartesian sense, not the Lockean sense. If you pursue these issues, you're forced to something like with Neo-Platonists we're grasping at. There are cognoscitive principles of the organization of mind, which determine what constitutes experience. Then we try to understand how the world works on the basis of that, giving up the hope of getting a picture that's conceivable or intelligible.
That's very helpful. In one of my conversations with James McGilvray, we talked a lot about the notion of constructivism, but also in the sense of that our mind largely makes the world. And additionally, you've also called yourself a naive realist of sorts. First of all, I would like to clarify, would you consider yourself to be indeed a constructivist, that label? And how do you look at the notion of proof in the context of constructivism, and just elaborate on the sense of, in what sense are you a naive realist?
Well, I'm inclined to go part of the way with Goodman on this, at least. We construct reflexively. It's not an effort. Reflexively, as organisms, we develop a certain intuitive concept of how the world works. That's the nature of our experience. Just take something as simple as saccadic eye movement. If I'm looking at a triangle, say, I don't see the image of the triangle. My eye darts around and hits various points in the visual image. My mind instantly constructs a triangle. Okay, that's even at the most primitive level, which Descartes sort of understood. His theory of perception, it's analogous to, he makes an analogy to a blind man with a stick. A blind man with a stick can trace the contours of a triangle and has the visual image of it. He says that's the way our eye works. Which is sort of on the road toward what we know to be correct. Okay, eye is just darting around all over the place. You get a few images, your mind. And in fact, we now know that from tachistoscopic experiments that just we control the stimulus, that just very few stimuli can make you think you're seeing a rigid object in motion, just getting a couple of points of light here and there. That's just the way, and the rest of experience works the same way. We don't understand how, but you're getting a rich experience from the internal workings of your mind. Well, what about science? Here you're trying to redo it in an organized, systematic way. So you first, in the modern period, since Galileo, there are things before, but systematically since Galileo, you try to get experiments. And an experiment is a highly idealized abstraction from the world. A good experiment throws out almost everything. That's the point of an experiment. So an experiment is a highly theoretical notion. The idea that you do experiments and construct theories is completely wrong. Any serious experiment is the expression of a rich theory in a particular domain. Says, let's try to throw it. In fact, if you're an actual experimentalist, you know that when you start to do experiments, none of them work. They give you the wrong results, so you got to sharpen, you got to throw this out, throw that out, redo it, And finally, you get an experiment that seems to conform to what the theory tells you ought to find. Okay, that's a good experiment. Then you work with that one and see what you can get to. But that's true of everything from the point of level of experiment up to developing, multiverse theories of universes, whatever it may be. So your mind is in this case, systematically and to a certain extent consciously, not totally, of course, constructing models that might give us an explanation of the phenomena organized by experience, by our cognitive mechanisms constituting experience, and to do it in the most deeply explanatory way. That is the simplest approach in terms of a notion of simplicity that goes way beyond counting symbols and so on. That seems to be the enterprise of rational inquiry, what we call science. And then comes the question, which actually Goodman raised. These are what for him it was much broader. These are just versions, like a Picasso painting and a direct photograph, are just two different versions of what you see. Neither has any priority over the other. But then he asks the question at one point, well, why do we even assume there's a world? All we're working with is versions, theories. Nothing is added to our workings by assuming that there's a world behind it. That's a pretty hard move to make, because you don't really have any kind of satisfying explanation for why the versions are this way and not some other way. Now, you could argue how important that explanation is. It's really just an assertion. Saying, well, there is some world out there that's making some of these versions work and other ones not. If you look at his book, Star Making, there's an interesting colloquy between him and Israel Scheffler about this. Several interesting discussions. Didn't have any clear issue. But I think those are the kinds of questions that arise when you move to naive realism. Actually, Russell once said that we are all naive realists, even though we know that our science shows us that naive realism is false. But we can't help being naive realists, believing that there is a world out there. It's not just readings.
That's very fascinating. Moving on to the issue of representation, so the notion of representation, I've noticed that you've argued that the contemporary philosophical dogma has been that representation must be a representation of something. And when I look at your philosophical views and kind of compare it with Kant and specifically focus on the theory of mind, I notice several similarities. So just to name a few, innatism, nativism, constructivism, modularity. However, on the issue of representation, I always see you and Kant go into opposite directions, so to speak. So I think it's a really crucial understanding, and I think it also relates to the issue of indeed external world skepticism, how we can avoid that. And Kant basically says that the idea of a representation necessarily includes the idea of something being represented, while you go on the other direction. So my question would be what I was thinking of. Your notion of representation seems to be very much tied up to an internalist view of the language faculty. And I was wondering, is there no sense that we can get a more broad, objective, cognitive notion that might play the role of representation, not in the semantic sense, but in a more broad cognitive sense? Would that be possible?
Well, I think there are two different notions conflated here, which have to be separated.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is the question of the referential doctrine. Do entities in the mind pick out mind-independent entities in the world? That's one question. A second question is, if you have representations, do they represent?
Mm-hmm.
The second question is purely terminological.
Mm-hmm.
Philosophers, I think, are deeply confused about this.
Mm-hmm.
Here they should go back to Wittgenstein.
Mm-hmm.
You want to understand the way the term representation is used, what its meaning is, look at how it's used.
Mm-hmm.
This is all about language.
Mm-hmm.
So in the studies of language, when people talk, or cognitive science generally, when you talk of representations, is the concept used in the sense of representing something? And the answer is no. So if you take a look at, say, what's called phonetic representation, simplest case, you write something out in the phonetic alphabet. I don't have a blackboard, but you know how to do it. You have symbols in that phonetic alphabet, say K-A-T for cat. Do the symbols pick out something in the world? No. These are called internal representations. But the representation is just something that gives instructions to the perceptual system and to the articulatory system. It doesn't pick out anything. So there's no K in cat. In fact, we now know that when you hear the word cat, you're not even listening to the first consonant. You're listening to the vowels that follow, and they determine whether it's a K or a P or a T. So the K, so yes, there is an internal representation, K-A-T, but it's not, but the symbols of it are just accounting for what happens in the world in a pretty complex way. So it happens to be the following vowels that are determining whether you hear a K or not. You hear the K, but it's not literally there. If you produce it artificially without the K and with the vowels, you still hear the K. Okay. So philosophers have to learn that if you want to understand the way people are using concepts, understand what the meaning of the concepts is, you have to look at how they're using them. The notion internal representation has nothing to do with representing in the philosophical sense. That's Wittgenstein's main point, trying to point out that confusion, saying don't be confused this way. And I think if we understand that, that part of the discussion disappears. The way internal representation is used in the cognitive science, it just doesn't entail representing something in the philosopher's technical sense. So I think that's all that's involved there. It's very, there's huge debates about this, but I don't think they amount to anything. The other question is more serious. Is there a representation relation? Is there a referential relation? Is there a relation between the word, say, London, and some entity in the mind-independent world? And I think the answer to that is flat no. Not for London, not for river, not for house, not for tree, not for anything. There are, in the sciences, there's a regulative principle, a normative principle that says, let's try to find concepts that do refer. So when you're a chemist, let's say, and you postulate that water consists of two gases, hydrogen and oxygen, you would like hydrogen to be something that actually exists in the mind-independent world. That's your goal, but it's a normative principle. So for the sciences, yes, you try to impose the representational doctrine. If linguists are debating whether phonemes exist, they're talking about the question, asking, does the word phoneme in our conceptual system, in our theory, pick out something in the mind-independent world? That's what you're asking. Of course, that could be in the mind. I mean, in the world that's not being construed by the mind theoretically. Well, that's a normative, regulative principle for science, but language doesn't work like that. It doesn't have any normative principles. It's just something that grows in your mind, like the visual system. And it turns out if we look at it, the words don't have that property. So I think the representational doctrine is simply false. Not true that the word cow picks out some extramental thing. It's more like what Cudworth is describing. You hear the infant hears the word cow, sees something, its mind starts working, has a rich set of concepts in there, finds one that's triggered by that sight, then it knows the word cow.
Yeah, that's very helpful. One question I was wondering about is, so Hume and Kant, when they have the theories of mind, or in Hume sense, the science of man, postulate certain important mental faculties. So they talk, for example, about the faculty of imagination, and Kant famously talks about the faculty of reason. Looking at contemporary cognitive science, can we still make sense of such faculties, such as like the faculty of imagination? Is it coherent to even talk about it in a cognitive science sense, or yeah?
It's a start towards, it's a useful start towards trying to open up the study of the mind to serious inquiry. But whether it's a developed theory is going to use these notions is pretty unclear. We certainly have something like reason, we do have imagination, but are they separate faculties?
Yeah.
I mean, are there real components of the mind which consist of reason as distinct from imagination? Maybe, but that's an empirical question. It's nothing that you can reflect about. You have to develop theories that'll account for something, explanatory theories that have these general principles of simplicity, elegance, and so on, and you see where they lead us. Maybe they'll lead us to break things up this way, maybe not. I just don't think I think the theory is just too primitive to say. So it's a good start, but we don't know how far it will go.
That makes sense. I have a few last questions related to, so moving away a bit from the philosophy of mind, psychology, and science, and moving towards the topic of anarchism, morality, and law. So I was wondering, in your view, what are the most important moral underpinnings of anarchism? And maybe even more broadly, how, if at all, do your political views emerge from kind of moral considerations?
Well, as for the latter, I would say almost completely. I don't know what else they could emerge from. But it seems to me that anarchism has meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's a very broad brush. But if you look at the major themes that seem to run through it with many variations, it seems to be essentially an insistence that we question the legitimacy of any human institution, any interaction among people, whether it's in a family or in international affairs, and ask whether that institution involves structures of authority and domination, somebody giving orders, somebody taking them. If it does, we then ask, is that a legitimate structure of domination. And the burden of proof is on those who say it is. If they can't justify it, it's illegitimate. We should dismantle it. And when you look at the world this way, it's very little that you can justify. So you want to dismantle them and construct institutional structures in which people are not subject to the orders of others. And that's all over the society. Taking a job, for example, is subordinating yourself to an authoritarian, virtually totalitarian structure for most of your waking life. For most of history, from classical Greece and Rome up until the 19th century, that was considered a total abomination. Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party regarded it as the same as slavery. American workers regarded it as a fundamental assault on human dignity. It's taken about a century of indoctrination for people to internalize the idea that your goal in life is to get a job and to be dependent on somebody else, to be their slave for most of your life. So, and one of the simple principles of anarchism was to question that, ask whether that's right. Should you be subordinated? Should any person be subordinated in that fashion? And that applies everywhere, wherever you look. So I think that's the moral foundation. Then come the question of working it all out.
That makes sense. And just one follow-up question, specifically on like this question indeed of justifying authority, and I would like to bring in Kant one more time, and then I will stop. But when discussing authority, most people talk often indeed about the authority of the state or the authority of the church. But Kant also famously talks about the authority of reason, which is actually self-legislating and self-justifying, and provides a framework of moral constraints. So not necessarily defining this is what you ought to do, this is reasonable. So Kant says, for example, reason is no dictator, but merely in the sense of these are negative constraints that ought to be in place at any moment of time. Do you see kind of those negative constraints? Can those be specified into certain principles? Of course, we have the skeptical principle in the sense of please justify yourself if there's authority, but are there additional specifiable normative constraints that you would say, yes, these are the top three in how I define anarchism that I think are crucially relevant?
I think that's implicit in our discussion of the moral underpinnings of anarchism. When we ask, is the structure, if we identify something as a structure of authority, we're using the principle of reason. If we argue that it is, if we ask for a justification of its legitimacy, we mean a rational justification. So if the boss says, I justify it because I like it, that's not enough. There's one of the leading economists, economic gurus of what's called libertarianism in England and the United States, very different from traditional libertarianism, but the kind of capitalist, anarcho-capitalist libertarianism, James Buchanan, he's one of the founders of public choice theory, Nobel laureate, one of the gurus of the movement. He argued famously that society should be based on human nature. And then he says, what's human nature? Of course, he says, well, human nature is he says, for each person, his ideal situation, his nature dictates that his ideal situation is to rule over a world of slaves. That's everybody's nature. In case you hadn't noticed it, that's your highest ideal, to rule over a world of slaves. Well, if that's the justification for authority, I don't think that satisfies the condition of reason. Yes, we're appealing to assumptions about reason. So for example, if James Buchanan says that's human nature, fine, let's have a discussion of theory of human nature and investigate it. I think we're going to find that it's pathological.
Yeah, definitely.
But That's the inquiry. It's an inquiry which will be carried out in accord with the principles of reason. If part of the argument is a P and not P, we discard the argument.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. One last question I would like to ask you, again related to anarchism, is about law in society. So one distinction that is often made in the philosophy of law or legal philosophy is between natural law and positive law. So I would like to ask you two related questions to law, and one also relates to the discussion you had with Foucault regarding the notion of legality, which I thought was very interesting, how you kind of define that notion. So to start off, how should we understand the notion of legality, and how do you think about the distinction between natural law and positive law in an anarchist society?
Well, first of all, we have to ask, we understand positive law pretty well. We develop it, construct it, produce it. But what's natural law? That's tricky. I mean, is it given by God? No, I don't think we can accept that. I think basically James Buchanan is right on this. It's what our nature tells us. Now that's, you can study our natural concepts of law. Infants have such a concept. One of the main infant researchers, Lilac Lightman, great psychologist, once pointed out that at a very early age, one of the first things that children understand is the concept, that's not fair. They know that right away. It's not a trivial concept. Jack Rawls devoted most of his life to trying to work out what it is. But infants know it instantly. That's not fair. Every child understands from when they can barely begin to express themselves. So there is some concept of fairness and of justice and so on, and we can try to figure out what it is. And I think that's as close as we can come to the concept natural law. Well, then positive law should presumably be trying to implement it. Now, this does raise a serious question. Why do we assume that natural law is correct? So how do we know we have the correct concept of justice and fairness? It may be the one that we universally have and that's built in, but what makes it correct? That leads us to the question of, is there some notion of correctness outside of our own cognitive and moral structures? Which, and if there is, what is it? Actually, there's a very good German philosopher, young philosopher named Matthias Malmann, Mahlmann. He's done some very interesting work on this. He's basically argued that the same questions arise in epistemology. So if we find the methods for getting to the best theory, we say, okay, those are the methods we use in what's now called naturalized epistemology. Who says they are the best methods? Basically the same question.
I see.
It's something, I think it's one of those things we probably can't penetrate.
I see. That's very fascinating. So, Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for this interview. I really appreciate your time, and I really enjoyed this conversation.
It's very good to have a chance to talk.
Thank you.
Bye.